Hi everyone, I have an interesting Campi Flegrei / Vesuvius update for you from both of the guys. If we look at the recent earthquake list, Vesuvius has been rumbling 3 times in the higher ranges with probably more earthquakes in the smaller ranges. In this list, this is only magnitude 1 and higher. So 1.5, 1.3, 1.0, it's unusual that I see 3 of that magnitude at the same day with only a short distance in between the earthquakes. And then Campi Flegrei again with a 1.8. Campi Flegrei is basically rumbling continuously at the moment while this Brady seism continues. That's why. An interesting interview given by an official of the INGV, but he says, I'm not talking for the INGV, I'm talking privately as my own person, as a scientist. And we've seen that before. So the official version of the INGV is like, all good, nothing to be concerned of. And then the scientists in leading positions that work for the INGV, they say something else. Let's look into this interview that Giuseppe De Natale has given. He works for the INGV and he's a volcanologist and he's the research director of the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology. He's observing Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius on a 24/7 basis. So he has given an interview and yeah, it's kind of, you will see, strange in a way. I mean, he's been warning about the volcano, about the supervolcano near Naples with more than 6 million people in the greater Naples area for years. He's always said your evacuation plans are shits, they don't work, and you have to factor in that the volcano could erupt. And he said this again now. He says we need to think about a progressive transfer plan. So why is he saying that now? Well, hint, if you're following my Campi Flegrei videos and you have seen all the recent studies right now that basically are alarming, and I said it, study after study, my reaction would be run while you still can. They do expect a sudden phreatic eruption, but they're also saying the creation of Monte Nuovo in the last eruption was preceded by a phreatic eruption that was making way for the magma. So he wants a progressive and well-planned transfer of a good part of the residents of the red zone, moving them away to neighboring areas. So why now? Well, again, I said, check my previous videos. I have a Campi Flegrei playlist. It's alarming what these studies are saying. So he says he's speaking about the earthquakes right now. And we've seen this often. They're talking about the earthquakes, but what is causing these earthquakes? That's the volcano. So he says, more earthquakes are possible as long as the ground uplift continues. The land is rising underneath Pozzuoli, especially underneath the red zone, because there's the Campi Flegrei volcano and magma's rising. So he says, we need to start thinking about this progressive and well-planned transfer of a good part of the residents that live in the red zone to neighboring areas. And he says, I want to make clear before we start that interview, I answer as always in a personal capacity for my experience as a researcher. So he doesn't want to get in trouble. So he says, in the area that he wants to be evacuated, the maximum possible magnitude of an earthquake is 5. And we've had even the head of the civil defense just said a few months ago, if we have a magnitude 5 earthquake in this area, or even Naples, we will count the unalived people. Because the buildings, and this is confirmed by structural engineers, they only lean to each other. The grout between the bricks is basically dust. They will collapse. It's nice that you talk about the earthquakes, but I'll get to this. So he says magnitude 5 is possible, and that results not only from theoretical seismological calculations, but also from the historical, and now it comes, chronicles of the strongest earthquakes that occurred, and now it comes, guys, before and after the 1538 eruption. So when I read this, I'm like, you're talking about the mosquito while the elephant's already in the room. So it's nice that you're so worried that buildings might collapse before and after an eruption. But what about the eruption? I think you should talk about this a little bit more, because the earthquakes won't really matter. I mean, I showed you a video about Pompeii. There's new studies and they found new bodies. They excavated them. And what they found was these people were lost before Vesuvius even erupted, because yes, their buildings were collapsing from the earthquake that preceded this eruption. So the rocks were falling on them and then the volcano erupted. But does that really matter if the volcano erupts? You know what I'm hinting at. But okay, maybe, okay, let's say we have a magnitude 5 earthquake before an eruption, and maybe we have all the buildings and there's not so many people, so not much will collapse, there's not so much damage, so they can do a better evacuation before the volcanic eruption. I think this is the main reason what he's basically hinting at. He was asked, well, Professor, the rate of land rise from 2006 until today has risen almost 1.50 meters. You're walking 1.5 large steps. So they're asking, what can we expect within the limits of hypothesis, of course, for the next few weeks? And he says, as always, more earthquakes are to be expected. The earthquakes, the seismicity right now is almost continuous. We see several earthquakes every day. Many of them are not felt, but many are when people have to run at night out on the streets again. And he says the distribution of seismicity by law of nature is such that and that's interesting, guys, really listen carefully, that the frequency of earthquakes decreases by about 10 times for each degree of magnitude increase. So what he's saying, he says, for example, approximately for every 100 earthquakes of magnitude 2, there are 10 of magnitude 3 and 1 of magnitude 4. Since the statistical distribution of earthquake frequency is constant, when the frequency of earthquake increases, what we've seen over the last 1.5 years at least, so when the earthquake frequency increases, even in the lower magnitude, the probability of having stronger earthquakes increases. I've talked about this before when we were talking about the risk for the big one in California and the San Andreas fault, when there were quite a few earthquakes in the 3 and 4 range. So does that relieve stress? Or is that an indication that the next one will be bigger? So same here. If we see many of magnitude 4, we could see a 5. Of course, he says, the strongest earthquakes are rare. However, this is why after each very strong earthquake, there might be a long time that passes before the next one. And that's why many think it's all over, but it's not. And he says, unfortunately here with this bradyseism, as long as the land is rising, there will be these earthquakes because there's tension in the crust. If you blow up a balloon and there's a layer of soil over it, it's cracking and that's causing earthquakes. And then interesting, the interviewer said, predicting earthquakes as we know is impossible. However, we know that as long as the land rise lasts, there might be increasingly larger tremors. So he asked Di Natale, what is the maximum range of possible magnitudes that we might be dealing with here at Campi Flegrei? And he's always quite blunt. I like this about him. He says, and that's interesting too, he says, This story that earthquake cannot be predicted is unfortunately a statement as widespread as it's erroneous, which in itself causes great damage. In reality, we know the areas where strong earthquakes can occur. We know what maximum magnitudes to expect and also their probability. Yeah, that is right. We know this about the Cascadia Fault on the west coast. We know this about the Nankai Trough in Japan and many other areas. It's just, I think what we understand with prediction is within the next 5 days, today at 3 p.m., right? So he also says, the only thing we cannot predict is the exact time in which they occur, but that's the crucial part. So, and he says, but this is almost useless information because the objective must be that, and he's talking now about Pozzuoli and the red zone, that the buildings resist earthquakes of a given maximum magnitude. And he's right with that. And so many areas that know that it is coming. And I'm also talking about the West Coast, Vancouver, Canada, Victoria, and Vancouver Island. They're not prepared. They have so many buildings that are so vulnerable. Same in Portland, these old masonry buildings, they're not reinforced. Many residential buildings. And I have my doubts about all these high-rise towers that they're putting up. Very fast, cheap materials, money, money, money. So he's right with that. But if there's a volcano at play, a supervolcano, there's another problem, right? So he's talking about Campi Flegrei. Again, he says, in Campi Flegrei, in addition, we knew very well, at least for the last 8 years, that the uplift of the ground had progressed and that we could have increasingly strong seismicity. What he's criticizing is they don't act. They have known for years. He said it at least since 2018. He said, why didn't you start reinforced buildings, roads, bridges? Now that many scientists say, well, it's too late, right? Now they're kind of somewhat starting. So he said, we knew that 8 years ago that we would have this increased strong seismicity up to the current levels and even greater. So he thinks there's more to come. He said we could and should have acted, checking the buildings at least in the areas at greatest risk, at least, because experts are saying Naples, it'll be a disaster. And there were earthquakes in Naples in the past where buildings collapsed. We've seen it in stronger earthquakes in Rome. What happened? He says, why didn't we check anything in the areas? And now he hints at this prediction where we have perfectly known the risk for years. Today, we would not have any seismic emergency like the one that we're currently having, and it's true. Ceilings collapsing, buildings shaking, buildings have to be evacuated, families are being displaced. People worry, is my home safe? Is it not? That's why they're running out on the streets with every shaking that they feel. It is an emergency right now. And he said we would not have that with that many evacuated buildings and the concrete risk that with each new earthquake, we could have victims. He says in this area, yeah, the maximum magnitude is about 5. That will collapse so many buildings already. And he says magnitude 5. This is shown not only by theoretical seismological calculations, but also by historic reports of the strongest earthquakes that occurred before and after the 1538 eruption. He mentions it again. He says like, yeah, if we reinforce the buildings for a magnitude 5 earthquake, then we're good. No, you have to consider what comes after, right? And then the interviewer asked another question. He says, Campi Flegrei is one of the most monitored supervolcanoes in the world. The other is Vesuvius. Let's dispel a myth. There's no correlation between the activity of one with the other, right? And that's a question that you are asking a lot in the comments. And there is no direct correlation, but could there be a transfer of stress that could shake one of the other? His answer is no, there's no correlation, although the main magma chambers, and here's interesting, that are located between a depth of 8 to 10 kilometers, they are connected. Not the shallow ones that Campi Flegrei has that have been discovered, but the bigger ones. But he says there has never been any correlation between the eruptions of Vesuvius and Campi Flegrei. The two volcanoes have profoundly distinct eruptive typologies. Vesuvius produces classic magmatic eruptions, while almost all of the Campi Flegrei eruptions are of the phreatomagmatic type. That means generated by the explosive mix of rising magma that meets surface groundwater. Because Campi Flegrei has a different geological setup than the stratovolcano Vesuvius. Then he was asked, at the moment, do you think that the most valid solution is the evacuation of residents from the red zone or something else? And the current evacuation plans, do you have an opinion, especially as a volcanologist? And I know he has, despite they have revised evacuation plans last year. And he answered, in September 2023, I suggested to the prefect at the time, before the strongest seismicity began, the magnitude 4 and above, to check as soon as possible, check all the buildings in the area that are most at risk, that is within 1 to 1.5 kilometers, so within a mile range, of the Solfatara Peschiarelli Agnano area. This is where we see most of the epicenters. This is the most active area with the fumaroles and where we could see a phreatic eruption. He says perhaps, and he also suggested that, evacuating it preventatively while the checks were being carried out. That is the area where, moreover, the population always has to be evacuated or alerted after the strongest earthquakes, and they continuously feel the earthquakes in the most destabilizing and dangerous way for the buildings there. And he says, and that is also the area, as far as we know today, at highest risk for a phreatic eruption. It's a very limited area, he says, in which a few tens of thousands of people live. And he says it's much smaller than the area subsequently indicated as at risk of bradyseism, which contains approximately 85,000 people. So he thinks that in the event of a phreatic eruption, the red zone will be a little bit smaller. So he says the red zone, which should be evacuated in the event of an imminent eruption, according to the current emergency plans, is instead enormous and contains approximately 550,000 people. And he says, as for the emergency plans, I have said several times, and I have written it in scientific publications, that they should be revised, at least completed, because since to date, it's not really known where the evacuated citizens would go. Okay, but at least have them evacuated, right? He says, the twin regions are known. That was outlined in the update of the evacuation plan last year, to which provinces, which region of Campi Flegrei would go. But then, he says it didn't get more specific. Where would they go? To a hotel, to relatives? Are there refugee centers? So he says it's extremely rough and an incomplete indication. And he says, and in any case, there are many places in the Campania region, so closer to Campi Flegrei, or where they could possibly be relocated with less discomfort because they would not be so far away. And then he says, and he's right, another issue that is never discussed is the duration of the evacuation, which, and he says reasonably, will be decades or forever. In fact, if the eruption occurs quickly, it does not mean that it will not happen, and certainly over 500,000 people will not be returned to the previous situation. He says the smartest solution is a progressive and well-planned transfer of a good part of the residents of the red zone to neighboring areas. The problem is we need to reduce the resident population in order to make the territory resilient and easy to evacuate even during an eruption. And he says for the rest of the areas, they can and must continue to prosper with tourism and other activities compatible with the nature of the territory. I think what he's trying here, trying not to create panic or damage the area, the property values, tourism industry. He's carefully trying, and he says it a little bit, how can I say, decorated with flowers. You have to act now. There is a risk of at least a sudden phreatic eruption. So make it easier, at least clear the red zone. Because we know if they need to evacuate quickly, there will be so much chaos, the roads will be clogged, the earthquake that precedes might have collapsed the buildings, which everything is even more blocked, and people will be trapped. So the less people live there, the easier it is to evacuate them quickly. I understand what he's saying and it makes sense. Guys, thanks for watching. If you want to support the channel, link is in the description. You can buy me a coffee on my buymeacoffee.com/silky site, and I'll answer with a 30-second video message so we can chat with each other. Or click the join button to become a supporting member of this channel for behind the scene videos and private stuff. And thanks for your supers. Thanks for watching. Check out the videos in the end screen. Really interesting stuff, I promise you, and I hope to see you there. Take care.